My name is Banning Lyon. My story is about why I chose to become a backpacking guide in Yosemite National Park and the circumstances that led me to that. After my parents' divorce, things changed really dramatically. My dad just vanished. My mom had basically a nervous breakdown, bedridden, non-functional. She came down with shingles. I just kind of became what she called the man of the house overnight at the age of 11. Overnight, my life really became a very dark, very sad place where I was sort of my own parent. After about a year and a half or 2 years, I ultimately heard from my dad again, and he was going to be getting remarried. I moved in with him, and the woman that ultimately became my stepmom, she was very young. She was in her late 20s at the time, and she was really into structure and trying to get me to do chores. And so we just butted heads a lot. And ultimately, I lived with them for about a year until they sat me down one day and said, "You can't live here anymore. Your mom is full custody. You're living with us as a privilege, and you need to go back and live with her." So I called my mom, told her what had happened, and that I needed to live with her. And she said I couldn't because her place was too small in Southern California. She said, "Just go ahead and fly to Dallas and live with your aunts and uncles until I can meet you there." I flew to Dallas. I lived with my aunt and uncle and my two cousins for a while. And then ultimately my mom moved to Dallas about a year later. We moved into a small room above my aunt. I was 15. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Granted, my life at the time was a little rough. I'd been bounced around from house to house, and I suppose there probably were people in my life who were concerned about me, but I knew kids a lot worse off than me at that point in time. I felt like a pretty average suburban kid. Nobody was listening to me, and I think that was one of the most aggravating things for me as a teenager. Adults just had these conversations over my head. They never listened to me. They never took what I had to say at face value. They never treated me like an equal. They just had conversations around me and about me, and I still identify with teenagers to this day for that reason. I'm 52, but I still feel like I'm 16 because I get it. I know what that feels like. They went ahead and signed me into the hospital. I didn't have a choice. It was either that or I run away, which I considered for about 30 seconds. And so I went into the hospital, and we walk in, and I'm just standing in this admissions office, and then they escort me onto this unit with these magnetically locked doors. And so I immediately felt out of place. And as the days went on, they said I'd be there for 2 weeks. So as the days went on, I would meet with a psychiatrist. 2 weeks passed and 3 weeks, and I'm like, why am I still here? So ultimately, the psychiatrist who had been in charge of me, he sat me down one day and said, we feel like you have major depression, or you're having a hard time making friendships, which I thought was absurd because they put me on in a unit with a bunch of adults. They said, we're going to send you to the adolescent long-term unit. It sounded nightmarish. A day or two passes, and they went ahead and transferred me. I walk across the rotunda to go to this other unit, and I look in these narrow windows, and the other unit, my adult unit, had been just filled with activity, like people smoking and playing cards. It was always noisy. And this unit looked deserted. It just looked sterile. I didn't see anything. This guy comes in and walks me through the doors, and they lock behind me. As I walk down the hallway, I look to my left, and they're having what's called a unit meeting. All the kids are gathered around in a circle. I remember this so vividly. And they all sort of look up at me. As I'm walking, I look in the kind of right-hand corner back of the room, and there's this girl who's strapped to a bed. And she looked like a cave girl. And she just watched me with this horrible look in her eyes, like she was like desperation and or despair. And I knew at that moment that something really horrible had happened to me. It was an experience that I will never forget. I thought for a long time that it had ruined my life. It took me a long time to get over all the things that I experienced there. Life with my mom when I was a child, like I said, before the divorce, was wonderful. Afterward, it was, like I said, my mom was bedridden. After a few months, there came a time where she would wake my sister and I both up in the middle of the night. We would sit around the kitchen table and we would just talk. My mom would talk about how lonely she was and how horrible our lives were. My mom was just kind of at the end of her rope, and I was 11. I obviously didn't fully comprehend how horrible this had been for my mom, and I had no idea what had happened. I didn't understand the circumstances of their divorce, and I got bullied a lot, but I've been used to that, and I was not happy, and my dad was gone a lot. So life in Texas at my aunt and uncle's house was emotionally, I felt sort of abandoned. I felt like I wasn't living with my family. I was living with people who obviously didn't want me. They were just sort of out of the goodness of their hearts, kind of taking me in. I just sort of emotionally didn't grow roots. I just knew that there was no reason to kind of build any ties with anyone because I was just going to be shipped off to the next place. And when my mom moved there, my life by then was kind of improving. I was bummed out. I was sad. And as a 15-year-old, I didn't know what depression felt like. Nobody really explained it to me. I was just like, life sucks. Like, I'm 15, life sucks. So I'm open to the idea that people would look at me and be like, yeah, that kid's depressed. Because my hair was crazy. I would draw on my clothing. I would tear it up. I listened to, bands like Black Flag and Minor Threat and Descendants. And there were a lot of things that people could misinterpret. But yeah, still to this day, I remember that feeling of not being listened to, trying to explain to people the circumstances of what had happened, and they would just talk through me, and they would ignore what I'm saying and re-ask me questions as if they hadn't heard my explanation. And I feel like, especially in the world today, we don't listen to each other. A lot of people don't listen to each other. They're set in their opinions, speak them to other people, whether they're political or whatever they might be. We've stopped listening to each other. While I was in the hospital, it's very hard to explain to what I call normal people. I don't think they understand what our hospital was like. So I was not allowed to go outside. We were not allowed to touch anyone. I wasn't allowed to have any private conversations. One of the rules in the hospital was keep your bedroom door closed. I had a roommate. My roommate was also in restraints. He was tied to a bed. They would ask me to close the door and I wouldn't do it. And so I kept forgetting this rule. And so each time I forgot it, they would give me basically a punishment, and they would say, you have to sit a 30-minute chair. I had to just sit in a chair in the hallway and not say anything or look at anybody. Hands, feet flat on the floor, hands on my lap for 30 minutes. And think about why I left the door open. Like there was some deep psychological reason. Finally, after a month on the adolescent long-term unit, my doctor said, we're putting you on indefinite chair. Any free time, any time in between activities, I had to sit chair. When you're on chair, if you do something that they don't like you to do, like laugh with somebody or make eye contact with someone or fidget, they say you get a test mark because they can't give you a chair because you're already on chair. They put me on what was called permanent chair in room. I had to sit chair in my room facing the wall, literally like a foot or two from the wall, facing the wall. When summer arrived, I was sitting permanent chair in my room for as many as 10 to 12 hours a day sometimes. I ultimately lost meal privileges. I had to eat meals in my chair, in my room, facing the wall. So I had lost all privileges. I had no privileges at all. And then thank God school came back. Once school was arrived, it was the first time in history high schoolers like, yes, thank God school, because once summer was over, I got to get off my chair for about 3 to 4 hours during school. You never relaxed. It was very quiet. Staff members would walk by my door every 15 minutes and make sure I was there. And sometimes a few staff member was in between those windows at 15 minutes just to see if I was doing something wrong. So what I discovered after a couple days on chair was if I tipped my chair backward and I rocked slowly, it would make the screen kind of disappear and I could see the outside a little more clearly. So I would learn to rock on my chair and look out the window, and I could see this tree kind of outside my window. My only joy in life was to see that tree. The hospital was also an incredibly violent, scary place. Some people who were in restraints had been in restraints for so long that they had sort of just been dehumanized. One girl had been in restraints. From my understanding now, she was ultimately in restraints, in bed restraints, tied to her bed for 18 months. During that time, she did not have a bath or a shower. Another friend of mine from the unit, he wound up being in bed restraints for 333 days. He needed physical rehab to learn how to walk again. There would be times that those people, staff would annoy them. And when you're in restraints, you have nothing left to lose. So you just kind of lose it. You just get angry. I saw a lot of really violent, horrible stuff. People would start slamming their heads into the wooden headboard of their bed, like trying to split their heads open, or people would tear out their hair, try to gouge out their own eyes. They would bite themselves and claw themselves, and they would scream. Like the sound for me is like, to this day, since I was ultimately in chair in my room, a lot of my experience of what I remember of restraints was the sound, disembodied screaming and shrieking, and not being able to see it was almost worse, because then your imagination dreams up things that are terrible. And so the hospital just became a very terrifying, very scary, very sad place. So after a while, I began to sort of just dissociate. It was like something inside of me separated from reality and was like, just became very numb. Because you just can't live with that stuff every day. And the reality of it, the pain of it, the severity of it, all of it, just you can't bear it that long. And so there just comes a time where it became very numb. And new people would show up and see it happen and cry. And I would just look at them like, I felt like a robot, and it's profoundly affected my life, like my relationships. So many things in my life are affected by this like dissociative sort of impulse that I have now. I've been on the unit for maybe a few weeks. The first girl left, and she had been on the unit for 3 years. Her insurance is pulling her. And she was crying. She was like, I don't want to leave. And I was like, what the hell? Like, why would somebody not want to leave here? And that was terrifying to see. Like, she was this beautiful blonde girl. And I was like, why is this like really apparently normal person not acting normal? Why does she want to live on a psychiatric unit and stay here after being here for 3 years? So the whole hospital became sort of a game to me where I'm dissociated, I'm numb, people leave when their insurance runs out. How can I make that happen for myself? So I was like, okay, well, the kids who leave act this way and say these things. I will act that way and say those things. So I began to like play a role. I would adopt sort of a persona, try to leave. And that was my whole goal. My whole goal there was to leave. And so I would go into therapy with my doctor. Be like, well, my parents divorced. I felt really sad and abandoned. But then they would tell me, this is performative. Like you're just saying these things. You don't really seem to feel these things. Yeah, that's true, because if people got angry or raised their voice, they got tied to a bed. I just found a way to sort of take what was true to me or what I was feeling and apply it. And then ultimately, after I've been on the unit for 9 months, 8 months, my insurance said, we're pulling you. And I was like, hallelujah. They gave the hospital like 3 to 4 months to get me out and find a home for me. So ultimately I was sent to a halfway house in Dallas, and that took place after I'd been in the hospital. When I began the process of leaving the hospital, I understood that blonde girl suddenly. I knew why she was afraid to leave the hospital. The first time I left the hospital, my first pass was to a bowling alley. It was during the day. I remember walking into this bowling alley, and there were so many sounds. There were people bowling, and there were arcade games and lights, and people would talk over each other. Conversations were not controlled. People would yell and laugh. The whole world just seemed like really chaotic and hard to tolerate. So by the time I left the hospital, I kind of realized like something inside of me, it's broken. I felt like I was totally not prepared to deal with the real world anymore. I felt worse when I left the hospital, way worse than when I went in. The halfway house was intended to sort of give me this controlled environment where I could kind of reintroduce myself to the real world. It helped. I mean, the halfway house was great. I loved it. We would all eat dinner together and cook, and we were responsible for our own laundry, our own grocery shopping. We had to kind of do our own bills. We didn't have a lot of restrictions, and life was really up to us. I had to take the public bus to school, but across the street was this graveyard. And so every night we would all just go across the street to the graveyard and sit in the back of the graveyard and watch. There was a drive-in movie theater like a block away, and we would watch. They always seemed to show The Shining. They showed The Shining a lot. So we would sit in the back of the graveyard and watch The Shining. I realized very quickly that something had been sort of damaged in me. It wasn't until in my 20s or 30s that I began to realize or learn or read about how, like in your teens, your prefrontal cortex, your brain essentially is rebooting. Whatever situation you're living in as a teenager, whatever you're experiencing, it's programming you for adulthood. Throughout my life after the hospital, whether it was people I dated or my friends, people who are wounded tend to find each other. There are so many people in the world who, just like me, have these wounds that make them feel as if they're completely alone, like nobody else is wounded like them, like we're each an individual jigsaw piece. I went through my life feeling very much like those people. I'm going to get kind of emotional, but I love those people so much because in each of them, I not only saw a reflection of myself and my wounds, but I realized all of us are not individual broken jigsaw pieces. We're all from the same puzzle. We all belong to the same puzzle. And our wounds, when we share them, they unite us. And you realize that there are not as many differences between us as you think there are. When I turned 39, I had gone through what amounted to basically 2 suicide attempts in my life. I made a decision. I was like, I'm going to change my life. Like, I cannot live like this anymore. So I became a backpacking guide in Yosemite. I'll never forget, there was the one trip where I was with my boss, and this guy who was this big Marine was about to cross this creek with his wife. And he sat down on a log and he started crying. And this guy was like this big, burly dude, and he's crying. I'll never forget this. I'm gonna start tearing up. They all 3 stand up together, the wife, the husband, and my boss. They all walk into the creek together. It's like a baptism. They all walk into the creek together and they cross it. And I walk up to my boss and I said, "Hey, what's going on?" And my boss looks at me like it's totally normal. And she goes, "He booked this trip because his brother drowned crossing a river and he wanted to finish crossing one for him." And I remember thinking, like, this is why I got this job. Without exception, that happens on every trip. My book, my memoir, is called The Chair in the Valley. It took me 6 years to write it. My amazing wife supported me through all of it. I wrote my book because I want people to understand that our wounds and our trauma don't need to define us anymore. Those things are not who we are. We are not the things that happen to us. And that nature, at least for me, and I think for many other people through what I've witnessed, is a key part of that if we just give it a chance.